This video is brought to you by Squarespace. At any given moment, any day of the week, somewhere in Britain, I can guarantee you there's a conversation going on in a pub about Margaret Thatcher.
People stop us in the street almost and tell us that Margaret Thatcher isn't just inflexible, she's not just single-minded. On occasion, she's plain pig-headed.
To some, she was a liberator, freeing the British economy. To others, she's the reason that the trains are always late, the NHS sucks, towns are quickly dying, house prices are soaring, and I'm pretty sure she's the reason it rains all the time. Today we're going to explore why everybody hates Thatcher.
Moving on now, tonight the world is mourning the loss of the woman known as the Iron Lady.
We don't think she made Britain great. She destroyed everything that we made and handed us over to the bankers and the speculators.
Celebrating the demise of the woman they believe destroyed their community, carrying a coffin through the streets.
When we look through history and we think about radical ideologies, we often think of communism or fascism and the crazy things, the revolutions that it took to get there. But we often forget that in Britain and much of the West during the 70s, we underwent our own insane radical revolution. And that revolution was neoliberalism.
Neoliberalism has provided the ideological framework that justifies the sweeping away of the power of people and its replacement with the power of money and the power of corporations.
A successful ideology is one that tells you there's no other way.
Let us stand together and do our duty, and we shall not fail.
Thatcher once coined the phrase Tina, there is no alternative. And it's kind of weird if you think about it, this dominant ideology, it's what we live under right now. However, if you mentioned it to most people, they wouldn't have a fucking clue what you're talking about. What's that you're waffling on about, mate? Neoliberalism?
Yes, that's exactly right.
So, where did this ideology come from?
And really, politicians, I think, should sometimes just be a little bit more modest about their abilities than they are. We can't run everything, and we shouldn't try.
The ideas of neoliberalism are pretty simple. Individual freedom, limited government, the belief that the government should really just stay out of your business, unless it is protecting you and your rights. Or, most importantly, the rights of businesses.
When the state does everything for you, it'll soon take everything from you.
And it would be so ideal if Thatcher had some kind of, case study to know if these ideas actually worked out in the real world. Oh wait, there was. In the 18th century, you had the OG libs. For roughly 200 years, this was the system that most of the West lived under. It was underpinned by an economic policy called laissez-faire economics. Basically, the idea was that the government should completely keep its hands off of the market and let the free market decide how to allocate resources.
Traditional economists at the time believed the economy, if left alone, would eventually heal itself.
And this was sold under the pretense that it would make people more free. It'd bring more prosperity for all and more equality for all. But in reality, it made the rich very rich, but it left the poor to be fighting over the scraps. By 1900 to 1910, the top 10% of property owners owned an incredible 94% of the wealth, with the top 1% alone owning 70%. For some reason, this glorious idea wasn't quite working.
I think the distinguishing feature of a slum is that the housing is so bad and the poverty so constant that the people have given up any attempt to make themselves or their homes look well.
So during this span, the classic liberalism, the laissez-faire economic era, financial collapses and banking crises came out like fucking Fast and Furious movies. Don't just take my word for it. Look at this graph. I've got the graphs here to prove it. And you see all these little dots, right? Those dots represent the numerous banking crises that happened in this time. Every single one of them, wiping out people's savings, putting people on the street, plunging people into poverty, all that fun stuff. And you as a reasonable person, you would probably assume that the politicians of this era must have been worried about all this chaos, this insecurity, and they must have done something about it. Right? No, nothing was done until the world went to war twice. A Holocaust had to happen before we said, I think the experiment's done. There was one final banking collapse in 1929. This one was called
the Great Depression. Starting with the October 1929 stock market crash, The Great Depression crippled the world economy.
Not to be confused with the original Great Depression in 1873 to 1896. They started to run out of names, so they renamed that one the Long Depression, and this one is now the Great Depression. In amongst this fucking rubble, a new economic theory was brewing from a man called John Maynard Keynes, where he basically said, lads, I think it's pretty obvious that economies don't just sort of bounce back on their own, like the free market doesn't just correct. Without a government to intervene, probably we're going to be fucked. And so whilst this new theory was brewing, and whilst World War II was happening, people were starting to notice that actually the government was pretty effective at mobilizing resources and directing economic activity. Not only did we blow up the Nazis, but we also discovered a load of technology to go with it. Computers, jet engines, penicillin, nuclear. We even got bloody duct tape. And so whilst this was happening, we started to realize that, when society works together toward a greater good, very surprisingly, it has positive outcomes.
From number 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister makes the momentous announcement for which the world had been waiting.
The German war is at an end.
This created what would become known as the post-war consensus. Oh, look, here he goes again. Jimmy talking about the post-war consensus. Now, historically, this was one of the longest periods of time of sustained economic growth in the West. And basically the ideas behind this was that the government would play a role to manage economic cycles and ensure full employment of the population. I'll show the graph again. Look, the nice graph. Look, you see how all those dots just sort of disappear? That's pretty interesting, right? The whole world stops collapsing every few years. Ironically, this period of time is often dubbed the golden age of capitalism. This period of time in which we were the least free market capitalists we'd ever been, it was characterized as a period of high growth, low unemployment, and rising living standards for all. The UK experienced nearly 3 decades of uninterrupted economic prosperity. We built the NHS, we expanded education for all, poverty drastically dropped, and productivity soared. And I'm not trying to over-glamorize it. There were a few little financial hiccups every now and then, but look at how it was before, and then during this period of time, you'll notice they didn't release Great Depression Part 3.
A wonderful thing for our businessmen and our manufacturers and our unemployed to taste hope again. But they must not allow anyone to put them back in the gold cage where they have been pining their hearts out all these years.
And prosperity won't come by inventing more and more lavish public expenditure programs. You don't grow richer by ordering another checkbook from the bank. And no nation ever grew more prosperous by taxing its citizens beyond their capacity to pay.
So before Big Mama Thatch came in to swing her neoliberal wrecking ball to fuck it all up, sorry, I'm meant to be impartial, before she came to liberate us from the tyranny of communism.
The honourable gentleman knows that I have the same contempt for his socialist policies as the people of East Europe who have experienced it have it for theirs.
Now it's important that we talk about young Thatch, aka Margaret Roberts. Young Margaret was a cucked lib, right? She supported the post-war consensus. She admired the creators of the welfare state. She even thought that rationing was fair. But you see, because the post-war consensus benefited the poor, this pissed off a very important group of people called the rich. Ever so slowly, these shadowy networks of ultra-wealthy individuals started to fund think tanks to lobby the American government. These classical liberal economists came together and said, look boys, the whole laissez-faire economics, it's good and all, but I think it needs a rebrand. Now these lot, right, they didn't just want the usual, lower taxes and lower regulations. They wanted to completely rewrite the rules of society. Before we go any further with this video, I want to give a massive shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring. Squarespace is the best tool, the most straightforward, easy and fun to use for making your own website. Whatever it is you do, it's very important to have a great looking website, and Squarespace has made it a whole world easier with their new design intelligence. Combining their extensive knowledge on creating website templates, plus the newest cutting edge AI technology, you can now, by adding in a few prompts, create a perfectly unique and customized design bespoke to you and your brand. As well, Squarespace's payment systems are now more flexible than ever if you are selling goods online to people from all around the world. With things like Afterpay, ClearPay, you can do buy now, pay later. Twitter. They also take stuff like Klarna, ACH Direct Debit, and Apple Pay, meaning that you don't lose out on customers because, I don't know, the website doesn't let you pay. As well, their visual design tools with their animations and effects, they will just make your website look more modern and representative of, hopefully, how good your brand is. So be sure to head over to squarespace.com/Jimmy the Giant, and to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain, use the code Jimmy the Giant. Anyway, back to the video.
I believe I represent an attitude, an approach, and I believe that that approach is borne out by the development of my own life, going to an ordinary state school, having no privileges at all.
Originally, when Thatcher was at Oxford, she read the book by Friedrich Hayek, A Road to Serfdom. At first, she didn't really get it. But jump forward to the 70s, and now Thatcher was just shooting out Hayek quotes as everywhere she went.
Our present political structure inevitably drives us into socialism, even if people do not want it in their majority. So I rather fear that we shall have a return to some sort of dictatorial democracy, I would say.
And you know, Hayek's skepticism towards democracy and a love for a liberal dictatorship, that didn't seem to put Thatcher off. If anything, it gave her more fuel. But then one sneaky bro would come along by the name of Enoch Powell.
Oh shit, here we go again.
Enoch Powell was very much against Keynesianism. He wanted a nationalistic Britain that took care of its own.
Powell became the target for demonstrators after his Rivers of Blood speech in Birmingham.
Enoch Powell was not a normal geezer. Like, he was very controversial. He had this speech called Rivers of Blood.
In 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
This speech was pretty much universally panned. Like, polite society completely rejected Enoch Powell. I'm pretty sure if he existed today, he'd be on a podcast tour by now. But Thatcher was very much for free speech, and she defended him.
Enoch was the best parliamentarian I ever knew. Everything in Enoch's speeches had to be worked out.
This was like Thatcher's entry into the neoliberal pipeline, but it wouldn't be until about the 70s, where another fella by the name of Keith Joseph came along and slowly started to radicalise Thatcher. Thatcher then just completely switched up on us. Now she saw the welfare state not as a safety net to help vulnerable people, but as a bureaucratic mess holding Britain back. And so now, as Thatcher had just been through her neoliberal awakening, one day she waltzes into a Conservative meeting, slammed Friedrich Hayek's book, A Constitution of Liberty, onto the table, and told everyone, this is what we believe now, which is totally normal behaviour for a leader of a Democratic Party.
A feeling among all groups of people that we can look for a new approach, a new hope in the new leader of the Conservative Party, Margaret Thatcher.
It was 1975 where Thatcher became the leader of the Conservatives. Another think tank had popped up onto the block, and that was called the Adam Smith Institute, founded by Madsen Peary and Eamon Butler. And these lot's ambition was to completely destroy the post-war consensus and to privatise everything. Railways, council houses, they even wanted to bring in a poll tax. And it's come out many years later that Thatcher's ultra-neoliberal manifesto called No Turning Back.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies, not for turning.
Whilst publicly she credited the MPs for writing this, it was actually secretly ghostwritten by Madsen Peary of the Adam Smith Institute. And like, look, as bad as these boys were, I can't lie, the Adam Smith Institute were genius. And that's because they had mastered the dark arts of lobbying without calling it lobbying. No, we don't pay off politicians, no. We're a think tank.
Who's funding your research on planning reform?
I have no idea.
As the corporate lobbyist Jeff Judson put it, think tanks are virtually immune to retribution. And it's because think tanks operate differently, right? They don't have to publicise who is funding them. They don't have to make that known.
What do you think we need to know?
I don't know, really. What would you like to know?
Well,
would you like a list of every single donor from the beginning in 1955?
And so instead of like really wealthy people coming over and bribing politicians or directly donating to their campaign, which there are rules and regulations for, think tanks instead can just sort of present these ideas as, you know, independent research, and there's kind of no harm, no foul.
The least transparently funded think tanks raised over £14 million in the past 2 years from mystery donors. These think tanks appear across across the media, like the BBC, have secured hundreds of meetings with ministers and advised the likes of the former Prime Minister.
These two, Madsen and Eamon, they would like hold court every Saturday with the Conservatives. They'd go out for a nice meal over a glass of wine, and by Monday morning, their proposals were now all over the front pages of every newspaper. And their strategy was simple: to make the British public terrified of British collectivism, socialism, communism, Marxism, you know, whatever they were calling it now. All whilst pushing this market-first, people-second ideology to become the new normal.
The government's just announced it's going to call a general election. How do you feel about this?
That's right about months ago.
With decades of fine-tuning their rhetorical arguments, the neoliberal revolution just needed one good crisis to go mainstream.
What the country feared has at last happened. Over 1 million people out of work, the worst figures since 1947. The government confesses that it's baffled.
Now, if we look at this chart, right, we love charts. This is a nice one. This is the unemployment rate, and this is inflation. And so the economic theory of the time, you know, Keynesianism, it worked under the belief that if inflation goes up, unemployment should go down. But like, if you squint your eyes real tighter, and you look here at 1973 to 1974, why are both lines going up? What the fuck? What's going on? Close your eyes! This period in the 70s, which was called stagflation, was directly blamed on Keynesian economic mismanagement.
And any other attribution to other groups of inflation is wrong. What produces it is too much government spending and too much government creation of money and nothing else.
But, you know, there's a small, tiny detail that these lot tend to overlook a bit. That, just coincidentally at the exact same period of time in October 1973, there was the oil crisis.
11 Arab countries cut off all oil shipments to the United States.
We are heading toward the most acute shortages of energy since World War II.
The price of oil just went to the moon and quadrupled from $2.90 to $11.65 per barrel. I don't know if you know this, but oil, it's pretty important to pretty much everything. Economists like Alan Blinder and James Tobin, they have shown that the high inflation in this period of time was as a result of these supply shocks and not due to an inherent flaw in Keynesian economics. But Thatcher, she chose to entirely put the blame on Keynesianism and state ownership.
The state has no source of money other than the money people earn themselves. If the state wishes to spend more, it can do so only by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more. And it's no good thinking that someone else will pay. That someone else is you.
There was no nuance to her arguments. There was no in-between and very little facts, to be honest. It was just very good-sounding rhetoric. It was all just the socialists. It was the communists, the enemy from within. Which, if you're beginning to notice a pattern with Trump and Farage, then well done, class. It's the same old playbook. And so, in 1979, Margaret Thatcher would emerge as the Prime Minister of Great Britain.
It's been a wonderful campaign for you.
May I just thank you very much.
How do you feel at this moment?
I regret to say that we're in the worst economic mess since the Great Depression. Excessive taxation of individuals, punitive tax policies, and excessive and unnecessary regulations, plus government borrowing, has robbed us of incentive and made overtime unprofitable.
Neoliberalism wasn't just contained to Britain, it was a global revolution. In 1981 in America, Ronald Reagan became president. And another one of these dope think tanks called the Heritage Foundation, which was funded by the president of Coors Brewing, like the beer company. They basically teamed up with Reagan and wrote the Mandate for Leadership. In this mandate, they had 2,000 proposals on slashing the American welfare state. Reagan goes around his cabinet handing out copies and tells them to get to work. And within 1 year, 60% of those proposals went live.
Success in politics is about issues, ideas, and the vision we have for our country and the world. In fact, the very sum and substance of the work of the Heritage Foundation.
And the thing is, it wasn't just the Republicans. Bill Clinton and the Democratic Leadership Council were on board too. They literally had Coke executives on the board, with corporate sponsors like Chevron and Microsoft funding the revolution. And one of their biggest gifts to Wall Street was the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999.
It worked pretty well for the industrial economy, but the world is very different.
This was an important act. It came from the New Deal era, and it was a law to keep the banks in check from, collapsing the economy, which they had a habit of doing every few years. But Bill Clinton and his backing of corporate lobbyists tore it down, and the floodgates were now open for big banks to take massive risks.
Now to my favorite series, Money, Power, Politics. There are few individuals with more influence in business and politics than these two brothers on your screen.
Billionaire businessmen and GOP mega donors, the Koch brothers. But exactly how much they donate is impossible to track. They fund groups not required to disclose donors.
In the 80s and 90s, the Koch brothers had set up the McCanter Center, dedicated to the righteous vision of economic freedom. The Koch brothers McCanter Center was feeding neoliberal ideas directly to George W. Bush, who had also created a hit list of public services that they wanted cut.
This thought took a while to thaw, it's going to take a while to unthaw.
No longer were the ultra-wealthy just whispering in the ears of politicians. Now they were putting words in their mouths.
And the countries where there are most good jobs are the countries which have followed for years my recipe now. It's just that I can't pick up in a couple of years what it's taken Germany 15 or 20 to pick up. But it will work.
So back to the UK. When Thatcher took over, she had one mission: crush inflation at all costs. And so she hiked interest rates, slashed the money supply, and just let the economy take the hit.
There is no such thing as public money. There is only taxpayers' money.
And the first few years of Thatcher's revolution, they weren't great. They were marred by inflation, war, recession. After Margaret Thatcher infamously shut the mines, unemployment surged past 3 million. But then, luck would go her way.
Liquid gold. Call it what you like. Britain now has oil, billions and billions of barrels of it.
With the discovery of North Sea oil. North Sea oil, which was owned by British Gas, ironically a public company owned by the state, meant that the UK was producing more oil than ever. And so by 1986, the oil prices had halved. In effect, this drop of energy costs boosted Thatcher's narrative of neoliberalism's success, allowing her to claim victory over inflation. Even the opposition admitted she was a success.
There is no doubt that the Prime Minister has in many ways achieved substantial success.
All whilst communities across the UK crumbled.
Over her 11 years, the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% in this country has widened substantially.
And so you might wonder, how did Thatcher celebrate, the success of this state-owned business saving the country? Well, of course, she sold it off to private ownership. Why? You tell me.
From France to the Philippines, from Jamaica to Japan, from Malaysia to Mexico, from Sri Lanka to Singapore, privatization is on the move.
And so, Britain moved from a once industrial economy toward an economy increasingly reliant on finance and services. While the South, and particularly London, thrived in this new landscape, much of the North went into serious long-term decline. All of those financial crises that seemed to be a thing of the past started to happen again.
Outside the capital, another 1,879 firms went out of business, an increase of 80%.
Tees Street on Merseyside, the street where every householder is out of work. 20 years ago, there were over 14,000 jobs in the shipyards. Now there are 1,300.
They've been looking for jobs for so long, they get to the point where they just totally give up and they got no interest in politics. They think nobody is at all concerned.
We've got to pond because we don't have money to buy food. We've all got to squat because they won't give us houses.
They could pull up their routes and move south where there are jobs, but even if work is available down there, accommodation usually isn't. They are trapped here in a lifestyle from which few, as things are likely to escape.
In a way, I always thought my job was to build on some of the things that she had done rather than reverse them.
Thatcher herself has been quoted as saying that her greatest achievement was Tony Blair and the Labour Party in 1997. And it's because what she had done was transform the political spectrum. She had moved the once left-wing Labour Party to becoming right-wing neoliberals.
We are on the same side, the same team, and Britain United will win.
Tony Blair went on a spree of selling off our British assets, often to foreign countries. Blair's government doubled down on deregulation and an increasing reliance on the banking sector, turning London into a global financial hub. But this reliance on finance came at the expense of regenerating these post-industrial parts of the UK and further deepened the regional inequalities that started under Thatcher. I talk about this a lot deeper in my North and South Divide video, so I'll link that below. Thatcher did this scheme called Right to Buy, where she flogged off a ton of our social housing stock for massively discounted rates to people. The aspirational working class could now buy a house for the first time ever. This was great. They became the middle class. But like realistically, this was kind of short-lived. As people sold off these homes, a massive chunk landed in the hands of private investment firms, who very kindly of them rent them back to the generations now. And so now we see a shrinking middle class. But you see, it would be a combination of Blair's policies combined with George Bush's ownership society.
I call it America's home ownership challenge.
That led to loan providers being pushed to back very high-risk mortgages called subprime mortgages.
They call those people Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Will increase their commitment by more than $440 billion.
And because Bush's administration was so reluctant to regulate, before you know it, Wall Street is knee-deep in these toxic mortgages, and very quickly the global economy was a ticking time bomb. A bomb that would explode in 2008.
A history-making 777-point nosedive. The NASDAQ plunged almost 10%.
So I think this is the most significant financial crisis in the post-war period.
Nearly 250,000 homeowners are in danger of losing their homes.
The bankers made irresponsible loans to homeowners, permitted them to buy property on margin. Then the housing prices collapsed, the mortgages couldn't be paid, and the banks essentially became insolvent.
In the end, the neoliberal revolution came full circle. All the bullshit, all the rhetoric around, don't worry friends, the free market will self-correct, was in one single crash disproven, as the glorious free market had to be saved by the evil government.
£50 billion of taxpayers' money will be offered to strengthen banks' balance sheets in return for shares.
Effectively, in 2008, neoliberalism died, or at least it fucking should have.
After all, it exposed its central features as, well, just a little bit flawed. But still, it dominates our lives.
From the grave, somehow, it just continued onward. Our neoliberal, small, non-interventionist government took £137 billion of British taxpayer money and bailed out the banks to pay for their greed. Of the $137 billion, $27 billion is still outstanding. And now on top of all of that, we offered around $1 trillion of public money as guarantees to investors. Whilst many Brits were made jobless and some homeless, the banks, who had caused the financial crash, were paying themselves bonuses. And so you might wonder, did this bailout come with some penalties for the ultra-wealthy? Did they have to suffer at all? And I know you're not going to believe it, but the answer is not really. In England, we didn't convict a single banker of any wrongdoing. Our government chose the route of austerity. We slashed public spending to the absolute bone. And who did it affect? Well, you guessed it, ordinary Brits.
Historians wouldn't say she got everything right. She opposed the reunification of East and West Germany. She called Nelson Mandela's African National Congress terrorists. Margaret Thatcher never held neutral views, and few people were neutral in their views of her.
Thatcher's legacy helped create the fractured Britain that we live in today. It in part led to the rage that created the London riots, the discontent that led to Brexit, as voters wanted to protest against the establishment that it felt had continuously let them down. It no doubt led to Trump in America, or reform in the UK. These strange parties with Frankenstein ideologies, just policies that are based on fear and populism, whatever sounds good in the moment. And what's most interesting to me is that it even seems Thatcher herself misunderestimated neoliberalism. After she lost her mind and thought that she was part of the royal family, then enacted an incredibly unpopular poll tax and the country rioted, she was eventually kicked out of being Prime Minister.
We're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11.5 wonderful years.
And her legacy is so hated that when she died in 2013, many people from around the country celebrated her death.
A ghoulish caricature of the Iron Lady loomed over the crowd, a gathering in defiance of critics who described the idea of such a party as disgraceful.
We've had 2 years. I've waited for this. I lost my house, I lost my furniture, community's dead, every pub and club's shut, and she did it.
I think that she was to blame for most of the ills in society, and most of the things that poor people and ill people now being blamed for were her fault.
Maggie, Maggie, Maggie!
However, as time has passed, her closest allies have revealed that she disliked some of the forces that she had unleashed.
The capitalists have given Margaret Thatcher a bad name, and it's they who should be responsible, not her, because she did not believe in excess. She believed in responsibility.
Some of the arrogant displays of wealth jarred very much with me and with the Prime Minister.
And to me, that's kind of it. That's the nail on the head. Neoliberalism is a game without rules. So while some capitalists will play it respectfully and honourably and create great businesses and treat people well, they don't have to. And the market doesn't really force them to do. It seems that Thatcher just had this British exceptionalism. Just this obnoxious belief that us British people, we're just, we're way too chill to do all the bad stuff. But ironically, her ideology that was obsessed with nationalism has literally resulted in selling off most of our once public utilities to foreign investment firms. 75% of UK rail is owned by foreign money. 70% of English water industries, Heathrow Airport, the British National Grid, even our own damn chocolate is owned by Americans. Americans! Have you tasted Hershey's?
It is something that has a chemical in it that is also in vomit.
It's American chocolate.
China own British Steel, and they have requested £600 million of British taxpayer money because, the free market is so sick it doesn't need the government, bruh.
Don't you think that's the way to persuade more companies to come to this region and get more jobs as I want them? Not always standing there as moaning minis. Now stop it.
And I really want you to remember, right, this is important. Her rhetoric, her arguments absolutely poisoned and brainwashed the British public into seeing the government as an evil bureaucratic elite. We have to separate the rhetoric from reality. If the government owns utilities, that means that we own the utilities. The profits go to us. Privatization means that billionaires own the utilities. All of the profits and any tax paid on those profits, if they pay any tax, goes to different countries and not Britain, all while they continuously offer lower and lower levels of service for us, the British public.
Since 2020, England's water firms pumped sewage into our rivers and seas for more than 7 million hours.
So right now in 2024, it leaves Britain in a very interesting time. With our new Labour government and Keir Starmer, we stand at a crossroads. And it's hard to know where it's going to go. Controversially, Keir Starmer took down Margaret Thatcher's portrait from his office. And the optimistic part of me wants to assume that means something. We have to remember, as much as they have failed us in recent years, Labour was the party that bought us the post-war consensus. This was the only period of continued growth, prosperity, and a surprising lack of financial collapses. However, will that 30-year window be just a blip in history? A moment where we almost turned the tide on exploitation and greed? Or could it be our future?
This is a new era. A chance to turn the page on a miserable chapter of decline with a different model of growth, a different set of values, and a different analysis of the state and its role in the economy.
I want to know what you think. Jump in the Discord. We'll chat about this further. Like, subscribe. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.